and I'm delighted to have with me Morgan Cron today. How are you, Ian?
I'm well, thank you. It's good to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you. I'm really excited. I was just telling you before we went live that how much I was enjoying your book, and I'm really excited to introduce it to all of our viewers. It's called The Fix: How the 12 Steps Offer a Surprising Path of Transformation for the Well-Adjusted, the Down and Out, and everyone in between. Now, I was immediately drawn to the title because I guess, well, let's have this framed as the first question to you, which is, what would be your message to the Christians listening who immediately see the book, The Fix Addiction, and think, well, this isn't really for me. I don't really need the 12 steps.
Yes, there's a wonderful Christian psychiatrist. His name was Gerald May. And May has this beautiful quote. He says, "To be alive is to be addicted, and to be alive and addicted is to stand in need of grace." And I hold that as a premise in the book that all human beings suffer on the continuum of addiction, from mild to severe, that this is what human beings do with their pain, and that all of our addictions, whether it's to work or alcohol or to drugs or to pornography or relationships or to food or to shopping, spending, et cetera, all of them diminish us. More importantly, what I wanted to communicate to people is that the 12 steps are a proven evidence-based design for living that regardless of whether or not you think you're an addict, right, or of any kind, would greatly benefit your life.
That's amazing. I love that quote you mentioned, by the way. And
Mm.
I guess sticking on that, like, if we are all addicted to something, we all have compulsions that are not becoming of the ideal. Where why do we do those things? If they are counterintuitive, if we know that they're wrong and yet we still go for them, what is the thing that's driving it?
Well, listen, uh, addictions are a way to satisfy or to address the pain that is inescapable in the human adventure through some other means besides God, and to fill a void in the heart that only God can truly satisfy. So an addiction is an external solution to an internal problem that eventually becomes a bigger problem than the problem it was trying to solve.
Right, I see. Well, that's a great way of putting it. It's such an interesting framing. It's not one that addiction's such a big scary word, and so I guess as I've been reading your book in preparation for this, it has been a very much a paradigm shift. But could
Well,
you? Oh, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say it is a new word and it isn't a new word, right? In the ancient church, it would have been called an attachment,
Hmm.
and in more recent in secular psychology, it became termed addiction. But the early church fathers and mothers spoke at great length about the dangers of attachments.
Right, I see. And how? What's your relation to this? You've written about completely different topics in the past, and you've chosen to focus on the 12 steps. Could you share your powerful story with us, and kind of, yeah,
Yeah.
how these 12 steps became really important to you?
Yeah, so I was introduced to the 12 steps many, many years ago when I had a, you know, diagnosed alcohol addiction problem. And I would say that my first go round with the 12 steps was a kind of auditing the class. I wasn't quite yet taking it for credit, right? And years later, I had a relapse, and that brought me into a relationship and an understanding of the 12 steps I had not had previously. And that absolutely revolutionized my life as a person of faith. And I really wanted people that had no exposure to them to realize, oh, wait a minute, these are for everybody. These aren't just for quote unquote those people. This is for us people. And that people of every stripe could derive the same benefits, the same life revolutionizing benefits from working the 12 steps that so-called identified addicts or alcoholics do.
And it's funny because I was but like 10 minutes before I jumped on, I googled the 12 steps just to have a reread of what they actually are. And I'm sure a lot of people listening will be familiar because you always hear the term the 12 steps. But I didn't realize until, for some reason, reading your book and seeing them, that they are like inherently Christian. They were designed to be very spiritual. I didn't, I don't know, I didn't clock that before. It's
Yeah.
powerful.
Well, first of all, the 12 steps derive from a Christian organization called the Oxford Group in the 1930s. It had 6 steps, and then the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill W., expanded it into 12 steps, right? Uh, and when you read the 12 steps, you realize this is not a self-help program, right? And I always laugh. I said, self-help is kind of a strange term because if yourself could have helped yourself by now, wouldn't it have done so? So it's like, the 12 steps, the purpose of them, the stated purpose of them is not to get you to quit drinking or overeating or whatever your fix of choice is. It is to facilitate a spiritual awakening of sufficient force and magnitude that it renders unnecessary your need for external fixes to your internal problems.
Hmm. Right. And so for you going through this, I liked that you said you were kind of auditing it at first, but in the book you share quite humbly and powerfully and openly about your story and the alcohol addiction that you had and the relapse that you had. And I guess something that came to my mind was, did you have to break any barriers within yourself to be able to kind of own this story that you have and be honest with it and accepting it? Because you were a priest, right? And you're a spiritual leader, someone that people spiritually looked up to, and yet you had to kind of take off the mask of perfection that sometimes pervades Christianity, and open up with that. Was that difficult at first?
Sure. Um, it's interesting. I've done probably 100 interviews about this book. And oftentimes, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but oftentimes when I'm asked that question, the subtext sounds like, weren't you ashamed to talk about this?
Yeah, I guess so.
Right. And my answer to that is, where should the shame lie? With the Christian community for believing that people should be perfect, for idealizing them, for placing them on pedestals that are unreasonable? Um, or is it on the person who dares to be vulnerable and says, look, this is my story. I hope what I've learned will be helpful to you. And I feel like it's a very unhealthy dynamic when quote unquote Christian leaders are held to a bizarre standard that is unreasonable and unkind, and actually censors them from actually speaking the truth about their lives in a way that would be life-giving to others.
Well, I mean, it is a really interesting point because that, I guess, that was the subtext in that you know I think all of us, when we are genuine disciples of Jesus Christ, we are faced with that time where we stop keeping up appearances and we come to this crucible of, is our faith actually authentic, be that a tragedy or you know um, an opportunity for serious repentance and
Mm.
reconciliation with God. And so
Yeah.
that's
So here's the irony, Ben. Okay, here's the irony. The irony is that when I walk into 12-step communities, into rooms of other identified alcoholics and addicts, and I shared that I have had a misadventure. I've done something that I didn't want to do, but here I am. They they clap and say, "Welcome back. We're so glad you're here. We love that you're here. We're here for you," right? But when I go to churches sometimes, they ask me the question, "Aren't you ashamed?" Now, what what is, to me, that's very strange, isn't it? What should be happening is that the Christian community should say, "Wonderful, tell us what you learned." Right? But instead, so what it indicates to me is a kind of sickness at the heart of many church communities, which is, how dare you take off that mask? That's very uncomfortable for us. And you should be ashamed of yourself. And I find that troubling.
Could you share the story that you shared in the book about the your pastor friend? Um,
Oh, yeah, Gene. Well, I call him Gene in the book. That's not his actual name. So Gene was the pastor of a large evangelical congregation in the United States. He had a secret drinking problem until one morning it was no longer a secret. He showed up at church uh deeply, driving under the influence, and he got up in the pulpit and started to preach, and the elders of the church finally realized, wait a minute, this guy is sozzled. So they take him out of the pulpit, and they did the very thing that you would hope a church wouldn't do, which is, they, instead of getting him help and saying, oh, this is what beings do with their pain, they said, you're fired. And then a few months later, maybe 6 months later, after he was terminated from his job, we were in the basement of a church where lots of 12-step meetings take place. And he said, Ian, isn't it amazing? I have experienced more love, kindness, welcome, understanding, compassion. I've received more help and acceptance in the basement of a church than I ever did in the sanctuary. And he said, how I wish the people upstairs in the sanctuary knew what was going down in the basement after hours, where miracle after miracle is happening under their roof and they don't know anything about it. How I wish they had a program of their own.
I thought that was such a powerful story. It really stood out to me when I was reading. And I guess, well, going off your point, because I mean, it's a really big point for Christianity in general. Is how do we, we're trying to not be hypocritical. We're all trying to not be judgmental. But I guess you come out and you know this now. Did you know this as powerfully before, or has your kind of understanding of grace evolved through your journey of addiction and recovery?
Well, I think I've always had a fairly robust theology of grace, but this experience certainly has confirmed what I've always believed. And maybe I've had more of a felt bodily experience of grace than I had previously.
Right. And could you take us through kind of what you now see grace as? Because you know, I feel like I'm still quite young. I'm still learning, and I'm constantly learning about grace. What is grace? When I first came to the term of grace, I thought it was just, I imagine a ballerina and the way that they hold themselves. But if you were to explain grace to someone who's not familiar with, you know, Jesus Christ and what he did, how would you explain it to them?
Yeah. Well, it's difficult because I love what I think it was Mary Oliver, the poet, said. She said, "Grace, I don't know what it is, but I'll take it." And at some level, it the term is so freighted that I think when we try to explain it in human language, we press language to its limitations. It's like at some point, language just can't capture it. Um, but I would say that for me, that grace is the the activity of God in the human life, evidenced by God doing for us what we cannot do for ourselves. So, in other words, grace is at the heart of the Christian message, and grace is more about a life that is surrendered to, how would I say this, to the process of transformation versus the typical Christian, well-intentioned but you know erroneous idea that grace is reformation, and those are two very different things. Reformation relies on you trying to make yourself more Christ-like by, using your own unaided willpower, right? Which does not work, right? Transformation happens when you give God consent to do in you what you cannot do for yourself. So it's the very engine of faith. Um, and and beyond that, I'm even uncomfortable saying that, because at some level there's a mystical quality to grace, and I mean mystical because uh, by virtue of definition, a mystical experience is one that human language just simply can't adequately capture. you know and yes, you can, my reformed brothers and sisters could come up with all kinds of answers about what grace is, and I find all of them interesting but never completely satisfying, and maybe a little bit too uh anxious in its doctrinal fussiness. I just think grace is the very heart of God and God's love at work in a human life.
I think that's beautiful. And how does that grace play out in the 12-step program? Like, how do you ensure that the 12-step framework is not just a tick box, and you do include Jesus and you do include grace within it?
Oh, it's all about grace. There's not a step in here you could pull off on your own. Right? And you'll hear that in the rooms of AA or NA or OA or wherever. I mean, listen, the 12 steps mm, are very, very clear that the person who is going to get you out of the mess that you find yourself in is God, not you. And it's always leading us in a posture of humility toward uh aligning ourselves with the purposes of God in our lives. So it's there's nothing about this that's about ticking boxes, right? This is about surrendering. This is about giving up. This is about saying yes to God on an hourly basis. And again, they're for everybody. So even if you're just uh, you know, um, a mom at the kitchen table or a dad at the kitchen table that doesn't have any identified addictions, like just working the steps would make you experience God in a way that would improve your life exponentially.
I suppose that links with how you say in the book that essentially, well, you would call addiction as sin and recovery as salvation. Like, it's much wider, and I guess that quashes that worry that addiction can be this big scary word, when actually it's just anything that we do, as you put it before, anything we do that is kind of not leading us to God, or not including God, or we're using something else in lieu of God. And that, well, that's why I love the book, because it reframes everything for you. And I certainly think that I will be using and looking more closely at the 12 steps for just aspects of discipleship. But actually,
Yes.
on that, like, is there a way that you can self-recognize that we're falling for these, well, the book is called The Fix, so these counterfeit fixes, these things that we do trade God in for, whether it's even just as small as, I'm stressed with work, so I'm going to, you know, overindulge on one of my vices to soothe me, rather than what I could do and what is the ideal for a Christian. But can you self-recognize those things and fix them before they get to this kind of overwhelming point? Because we always hear, the 12-step program is for those, out of rehab, or after this big, like, I spoke to someone quite recently on the show who was caught by the police doing something and it always seems to get to that point. But how do we recognize it before then? Is it like, would you say the 12 steps is involved in that, just constantly being aware and constantly working on these things?
Well, I think all of us know that we have fixes, right? I mean, let me ask you a question, Ben. Do you got any fixes?
Oh yeah, chocolate is a massive one. I don't, and I don't even joke. Like, I eat way too much chocolate, but it's like a comfort blanket. If I have a bad day at work and stuff, I'm gonna go to the supermarket and I'm gonna get a bar of chocolate. Um, yeah.
Yeah. So that is a fairly mild fix, right? Or addiction, one that you could probably, with a little bit of effort, conquer, like just
it
be able to
seems
put it
it
aside.
seems challenging.
Yes. But now here's where it would get darker. Let's say your doctor said to you, your blood sugar is way too high, and so you have to stop eating chocolate. But you keep eating chocolate despite the negative consequences, right? Then I'd say, oh, that sounds more like an addiction than a peccadillo, right? That
Hmm.
that sounds like something really problematic. Um, because an addiction, if I was going to give it I mean, from a clinical standpoint, if I was going to give it a definition, I'd say it's any pathological relationship that you have with a person, a substance, or a behavior that has mood altering effect and negative consequences, right? So, I think there are addictions on the mild end of the spectrum, or just bad habits that people can address on their own, and there are others that are more problematic. So let me give you somebody I was working with the other day. I work as a therapist. I'm not only an Episcopal priest, I'm also a therapist. So I work with workaholics. I've seen workaholics do as much damage to themselves and to their families as alcoholics do.
Hmm.
Okay. I know people who spend, you know, 15, 20 hours a week watching Netflix, right? Or, scrolling on TikTok 2 hours a day. Or, they may be people that are in relationships that have an addiction quality. That's called codependency. I work with these people all the time. They're not people, you see them in the only reason that people don't, and actually, I could argue that these people in these categories actually suffer more than most chemical addicts, right?
Hmm.
Because they can get away with it for a long, long time before the consequences ever come home, right? And whereas if you're an addict or an alcoholic, it eventually becomes fairly public, right? And there are places to go to get help, people to see to get help. I feel sad for the people who are in places of quiet desperation, guys I know that have porn addictions, and on, which is, you know, epidemic, right? So, I mean, addictions are going to become and are becoming increasingly um, catastrophic in the population as a whole.
There's another interesting side of this that I thought from your book, which is there's you allude to even religion and God can become an addiction. And I
Yeah,
really
sure.
thought about this, and I think my faith as a Latter Day Saint, we're very strong, close knit communities, and it's a very practice based one. We have a lay ministry, everyone gets involved, and you get stuck in, and it's an active membership. And so I wondered, in your head, what does religion and God as addictions look like, and how can we discern between dependency and our genuine devotion? How
Yeah.
can we spot when we think we've got a relationship with God, but actually it's a really unhealthy one?
Yeah. It's the only disease that will tell you you don't have a disease. Right? Um, yeah, I mean, look, I can speak about, sometimes I've been around people, we call them in psychology, we call them spiritualizers, right?
Hmm.
So there's a, a significant point of pain in their lives, and they're constantly reframing it through the lens of spiritual language, right? It's like, oh well, and so it's called spiritual bypassing, right? It's like, I don't want to have these feelings, so I'm just going to wrap this up in Christian language and say that God is good, instead of really, like, diving in and doing the work, right?
Yeah.
And to me, that just sounds like, well, wouldn't it be simpler to make a martini and get, like, it's just the same thing. You're just trying to avoid dealing with the pain and the complication of life, but using God as your substance, right? God can be a comfort. That's different. God can be a source of solace. That's different. But when you use, and listen, I go to, I get to speak at churches all the time, and some of them are not Episcopal churches. Some of them are, mega churches, and they have, you go to their worship services, and sometimes I think it feels more like, uh, it can become dangerously close to being um, a sort of a pain relieving uh, search for communion with God, but not in a way that feels very healthy to me. Um, and that, I mean, that would require a little bit more unpacking. But
Mm.
um, you know, our relationship with God is insanely complex. And on many levels, we experience things like disappointment, anger with God, um, a feeling of abandonment, right? These sorts of things. We shouldn't wrap it in spiritual language, which to me just feels like turning God into some kind of a drug, to avoid the pain of what it means to follow God. Well, or that's just inherent in the journey of following God.
So how going back to the phrase that Gene would use in these kind of the basements of grace, the what's happening actually under the church. What would your advice be to those listening to how you can engender something more like that, a more transformative church experience um, in church? And I say that individually and as a congregation, within our families, within our kind of Sunday school classes, so that church can really be transformative and not just kind of
Yeah.
attending a sermon to say, great, I've been to church. I feel good that I've been there.
Yeah. Well, first thing we could do is normalize brokenness,
Mm.
right? And we say it theologically, oh, but it's just not actually welcome, right? It's like there's still a lot of personnel, or I should say, image management and landscaping, right? We're always embroidering our image, right? And I don't think to many people churches feel like safe places to go and just be who you are with all of your beauty and all of your brokenness, right? And so, and again, like normalizing brokenness doesn't mean endorsing it. That's different, right? What I'm saying is that we should be a place that really welcomes our telling the truth about our life experience so that we can become the highest expression of ourselves. Um, I mean, really, some of the most shaming places I've ever been have been churches. And it's usually, again, nobody says it out loud, but we can feel it. Like, don't tell the truth. Whatever you do, don't tell the truth here. Maybe go tell the truth in the pastor's office. Maybe, but certainly put on that I got it all together face, and show up on Sunday, but don't let anyone really know what's going on. That should not be what church is like. That's not what it should feel like. Ironically, that's what it feels like when you go to a 12-step meeting.
I just, it's really interesting that you say that because I've been through a really sort of life changing experience the last year with a serious health issue that I had, not to do with chocolate, by the way. But it was, to be fair, what you said after that was I overworked myself to the point where I had a very serious autoimmune illness that stopped my life and was very debilitating and excruciatingly painful. And top and bottom of that was that I couldn't wear a suit to church because it was too painful on my skin. And actually, there were many weeks where I couldn't even get to church because I was just too physically unwell. And it was a very introspective time for me because I felt that unspoken shame, and I don't know why, and I don't know where that comes from. Well, comes from Satan. Ultimately, it doesn't come from God. But when I went to church and I wore kind of casual clothes and I was kind of like, oh, we all have that kind of keeping up appearance as part of church because we see the same people every week. We naturally as humans compare ourselves to others, and I expected that shame to come forth, and then when I actually went And I still felt like I was like, I'm probably going to get judged here, and I'm just going to have to sit with it. But actually, what happened was some friends at church came and expressed their love for me, asked me how I was, and made me feel really loved. And so, when I listen to you say that, I think, yeah, we do need to normalize brokenness, because actually, maybe if we feel the shame, it is unspoken. Actually, when we do come forth with our issues and the things that we're actually wanting God to heal us from, all I've received really is love. And I understand there are other people who have maybe had negative experiences. But yeah, that's my experience, is actually when I had the courage to come and bring my kind of guilt and shame and my brokenness, I was met with great love, and it really surprised me.
Mm. Well, again, um, I want to be careful that I don't say that every church community is, messed up in this regard, but plenty are. But plenty are. And it seems to me that that's a rather tragic thing. And how we get the magic of what happens in the basement of churches and 12-step meetings upstairs is actually quite difficult. Because here's the deal. Now I'm going to get harsh here. Not harsh, but I'm going to get direct. All right. For lots of people upstairs, my impression as a pastor over the years has been that God is a preference, not a need.
Hmm.
But in the basement, either there is a God or I'm dead.
Yeah.
So in the basement, God is a need. Upstairs, God is a preference, right? If you are quote unquote managing your life well, then, you know, we don't have this sense of desperation, like I desperately need God. So the gift actually of an addiction is desperation. And that desperation thrusts you into the love of God in a way that is really quite profound. It's the reason why you often hear people in 12-step meetings say something like, my name is Jim, and I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic. And you hear the word grateful and you think to yourself, what on earth would you be grateful for? Right? But the fact of the matter is, what Jim is saying is, I am grateful I'm an alcoholic because that experience drove me into an experience of God I would never have had otherwise. And it has given me a life I never would have had otherwise. So now it's no longer my enemy, it's my teacher. This addiction now is my teacher. It has become actually a blessing. I know in the book I use that beautiful scene from C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, right? Where I won't go into too much detail about it, but this fella who essentially surrenders an addiction, the addiction itself in the form of this little serpent on his shoulder, right? Um, Transitions or transforms into a beautiful white steed on which the guy rides off joyfully. And so, this is a beautiful metaphor for what I think recovery looks like.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I loved that story in the book. It's really powerful. And well, following on slightly from that, one of the quotes that has stood out um, from the book is, and I want to get this right. You may have to correct me. Christianity is long on the what, but short on the how. Am I saying that correct? Is that right?
Yes, yeah.
And yeah, I'm one of the main fascinating things from the book for me, and I guess it's reflected in the title, is how the 12-step program can actually become a much more general framework for discipleship and repentance outside of addiction. And could you delve into that and just share with us how we can kind of leave this podcast and really take these steps uh, into our daily discipleship?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I meant when I wrote that was we're long on the what, meaning theology, and we're long on being descriptive, but not particularly prescriptive, right? Or to put it another way, for many Christians, their faith or their experience of God is belief based versus practice based.
Hmm.
So, in other words, if I just believe or give intellectual assent to these propositional ideas about God, these theological things, then I'm a Christian, right? All right. Now, whereas the 12 steps are to some degree belief based, but more they're practice based. Here's what you do. Here's what the gospel looks like when you live it. Right. Here's what the gospel looks like when it's more than a set of beliefs, when it now has become a lifestyle. And so the steps actually are they're kind of a rule of life. If you think about a Benedictine rule of life, or you think about a Franciscan rule of life, right? If they have that quality to them of here's how I live my life, and here are the steps that I draw on every day that influence how I make decisions, that influence how I relate to other people, to myself, to God, and so in that regard, they're a beautiful map for Christian living.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I feel like a key thing here, and a key thing that's missing in a lot of congregations is vulnerability, um,
Hmm.
and that vulnerability is, I think, really the first step of the 12 steps. Really, it's uh, so for we admitted we were powerless and that our lives had become unmanageable in a way, and uh, that I, I don't know if I've taken this from the correct website or not, but that's a general first step of the 12 steps. And I just love that in the sense of it's so important, and your life really changes when you realize that we rely so much on God. And that's almost like a paradox because we want to have control over our lives. But
Yes.
really, there's so
Hmm.
much power in surrendering. And I think that's a great message of the book.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways that addiction shows up in a life. We could all say, we admitted we were powerless over sin, that our lives had become unmanageable. Sin,
Mm,
I mean,
yeah,
do you have an addiction to sin?
that, absolutely. Yeah. Sin every
Okay.
day.
Do you have an addiction to playing God?
That's interesting. I would say I do. Yeah, I really want control over
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, all we have to do is read the story of Eden to figure that out,
Okay.
right? Like, in fact, one could say that the first addictive transaction between a dealer and a user happened when Eve reached and grabbed the apple. You see where I'm going?
Mm,
In other words, every human being has an addiction to control. Everybody wants to play God, not and they can do it very subtly. You know, uh, we want to control people, places, and things, and it doesn't work. And then eventually your life will become and unmanageability doesn't necessarily mean, oh, I lost my house, I lost my car, I lost my marriage, my kids don't talk to me because I have an addiction problem. Unmanageability could be, how about emotionally unmanageable?
mhm.
Or we feel like our thoughts are unmanageable, like they're tyrannizing us. So all of these things could be addressed through working the 12 steps.
Do you have any? Obviously, a huge part of why I think this is great is it focuses on personal responsibility and like how I can apply this. But I wondered if you had any advice on how to help someone, you know, um, with addiction, or not even addiction, but helping them along and getting them to do the 12 steps. I liked in the beginning of your book you mentioned this isn't really a book that you're going to buy for someone else. Maybe it would maybe come across as a bit rude, but you'd buy it for yourself. But how would you go about helping someone who you're worried about and you want to bring back to God?
Okay, so are you talking about somebody that is an identified addict or alcoholic or something, or what's be more specific?
It's hard in my circles. I wouldn't even know how to recognize that unless it got to a really bad stage. But I guess I'm thinking in my head, if I'm at church on a Sunday and I'm noticing that someone hasn't been there for a few weeks or something, and I want to try and minister to them and help them. How could I apply the lessons that I'm learning in this book to helping someone else as well?
Yeah, so the best thing you can do for them is work the steps yourself. And if you work the steps yourself, right? I mean, here's the thing. Like we often are thinking, how can I intervene in another, and I'm not saying it's not well intentioned, but how can I help someone else? And as a therapist, as a priest, I'm often telling people, work on yourself. Like just, you know what I mean? Like work on yourself. And then in the process of working on yourself, opportunities will arise. But you have to be the healthiest person that you can be, and the most Christ-centered person that you can be. And obviously, these can be done in parallel with each other, but it is important that we, you know, like I oftentimes will hear people say, "Man, I really want to change this person." You know what I mean? And I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Good luck with that." That's playing God.
Mm,
Now, again, I'm not saying that, if so and so is missing from church, don't call them, right? I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is make sure that you're doing your own work before put on your own oxygen mask first before placing it on your child on the plane, right? Like if that's the important thing to do.
yeah, I think that's such a powerful message. Is you'll get to those things if you work on this yourself. It's like Jordan Peterson always says: if individually we live well, collectively we'll flourish, and those things trickle down. So yeah, I love that. And you know, stepping into the role of that person who, as we said before, yes, shame and make you feel guilty is wrong, and but it does happen in the church. And if I am a person who recognizes myself in some of the stories you've shared and in some of the things saying, yeah, I'd love to break free and feel redeemed, but I'm scared that I've gone too far, or that I'll be shamed because what I've done is terrible or something. What would you say to?
Yeah. Well, often, the fifth step of the 12 steps is admit it to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. All right. And I have sat and listened to lots of people share their fifth step with me. So they are actually telling me everything they've done wrong. And oftentimes and I've heard some doozies, okay? And
Jesus.
but someone will say to me, "Oh man, I am the worst." No, I am the worst. I just the most horrible person. And I'll say, "Don't flatter yourself." Like that's just a weird kind of narcissism to think that you are the best at being the worst. That's crazy, right? All you have to do is read St. Augustine, for crying out loud. St. Augustine takes most people to task. I mean, uh, you know,
Does
we
he
we
really?
we tend to. What's that?
Does he really? I'm not familiar.
Oh my gosh, just read about the life of St. Augustine. My gosh. Read the life of St. Francis prior to his conversion.
Mm,
These people were out of their minds. And living really profligate lives. And so, I'm always like trying that's to me, that's a very egoic response, right? And part of what this 12 steps does is it very graciously but pointedly deflates the ego. Because guess what? I guarantee you, Ben, if you were to sit with me and rehearse with me all the most shameful things that you've ever done in your life, right? I would sit and listen and I'd say, yeah, me too. And that's what church should be, by the way. Church should be a place where me too is the most commonly used phrase. And you're forgiven should be the most commonly used phrase, to receive an assurance of pardon. That should be the language we speak, and I hope that more and more churches do that because that's what happens downstairs in those 12-step meetings.
hmm I absolutely love that. I'm interested, Ian, where you got your faith from because you have such a great outlook on this, and you know, you seem to. I don't know. I'm learning so much from speaking to you. I'm wondering, where did you get your kind of faith in Jesus
Yeah.
and outlook?
Well, my faith began in a Catholic church in Greenwich, Connecticut. As a little boy, I was educated in the Catholic school, in Catholic schools, and attending Mass regularly was part of things. And I was very naturally drawn to all things spiritual. I was very, I just gravitated toward the toward mystery in some ways. Um, Later on, I was involved in high school in a evangelical youth group, and that was very formative for me. And 3 times in graduate school and learning a ton. And yeah, my whole life from the time I was a boy was I felt haunted by Christ from the time I was a little boy. And I have gone through many iterations in that relationship. But now, as a mature man, um, I find it very interesting that that has been the constant in more than any other thing in my life. That has been the constant, which is the presence of God in all things.
And what's your role now? Are you a priest now? Is that your role now?
Yeah.
Was that
Well, once you're a priest, once you've been ordained a priest, you're a priest forever. Whether you're in a
okay?
parish or not, you're a priest forever, right? So I volunteer at a parish at a place called Vanderbilt University in Nashville. There's a little Episcopal chapel there, but I volunteer there really. I don't, I'm not a paid staff person. I show up on Sundays. I go, "Oh, do you guys need help?" And invariably the answer is yes. And but all of my life really is pretty dedicated to just speaking, writing books, and I have coaching clients, and of course, my work as an Enneagram teacher, right, which has
Yeah.
been the thing that I was most known for. The Fix, this new book, was a passion project, right? I mean, most of my stuff is in psychology and then around the Enneagram and other things. Um, I just felt like this was a book that wanted to be born, and I had to be the guy to do it. So Um, I don't think I'm now going to become the 12-step guy. I think I'm stuck with Enneagram guy for the rest of my life.
You do really get the sense though that it is a passion project when you read it. Was it quite liberating for you to be able to get this down on paper and speak
Oh
freely
man.
about your faith?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's my fifth book, and
Yeah.
I have to say it was the book I had the most fun writing.
Hmm.
I just had a blast uh taking the steps apart and making them applicable for the everyday person. And I mean, the book, interestingly, it, you would think that a book on the 12 steps, addiction, all these problems that we have would be rather glum. And it is not. The book is actually, I think, kind of a fun read. Um, it's laced with with humor, at least as I understand humor. And it's a very hopeful book. It's a book filled with, I think, insights that have been helpful to me, and I hope will be helpful to others.
They absolutely will be. That if I was going to say if you could sum it up in one word, I would describe it as hopeful or joyful as well. It's that's the sense. That's the big sense of it. So yeah, I appreciate you writing it and appreciate you coming on today. I loved it, and I really recommend people do go and have a look at it because you break down in these chapters the steps and really go into them with this great commentary, personal experiences, and yeah, it's just hopeful. I feel like, as you've said and we've discussed in this conversation, whether or not you feel like, oh yeah, I actually have something I really want to fix, I really want to solve. This is a much more general way as well for improving how you
Hmm.
live as a Christian, and that's something I really appreciate. Well, my final question is: what is the biggest misconception about healing from addiction?
Well, maybe the biggest one is that and we were talking about this earlier, is that the 12 steps are really um, more of a self-help program than a God-help program. But to be clear, they are not a self-help program. They are a program about learning to live harmoniously with God, with yourself, and with others. They are about reorganizing your life and entering into a relationship with God that will lead to a complete psychic change. That's what they're designed to do. And there's evidence based on the lives of tens of millions of people whose lives have been saved by the 12 steps that they work, right? This is not me coming up with 12 steps to a happier Christian life. It's like, no, I can actually point you to millions and millions of people who've done it and their lives have been radically changed. And that is available to everybody, not just to self-identified addicts. So reading my book, doing the workbook in a small group or by yourself, I promise you will have really, great benefit on people.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Ian. And what's the easiest way for people to be able to keep up with your work?
So many ways. Ian Morgan Cron, CRON.com. That's my name on all my channels, social media wise. I have, these 5 books. The new one, obviously, The Fix, How the 12 Steps Offer a Surprising Path of Transformation for the Well-Adjusted, the Down and Out, and everyone in between. My wife likes to say there's more words on the cover than there are inside the book. Yeah, on my website, you can hear and read about all kinds of stuff that I do.
Brilliant. Well, I'll be sure to include all those links in the description below for people. Do go and check it out. And yeah, once again, thank you so much for joining me for an hour, Ian.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching For All the Saints. This show needs your help to grow. Please like the video, comment your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone you think would enjoy it. Thank you.